Hi everyone, this is Dr. Liz, and you're listening to Include with Dr. Liz. This show is about everyone, all people, including you. It's about people and their diverse lived experience in this world. I chat with guests to get to know them, their identities, and their inclusion needs, so we all have an opportunity to understand how best to include them, so together we can create a world where everyone thrives. A former tenured professor of religious studies and American expat living in Turkey, Rose is a courageous, compassionate, clever, and complex mother raising her son on her own. After stepping away from a job that most people never leave, she has found a better life in supporting others to become unstuck in their own lives. Welcome, Rose.
Thank you. And wow, I love that description. Thank you for creating that. Well,
Well,
it's wonderful to be here.
you're welcome to steal it and use it in any way, shape, or form.
I just might.
um, okay, so I've been really looking forward to this episode. I know if people have been listening for a while now, they'll think I say that all the time. Maybe I do, but this one I really, really, really have, and which will unfold as to why, I guess, throughout the episode. I'm curious to start with asking, what took you to Turkey?
Good question. Well, I've been coming here for a long time. I think the first time I came here was when I was in between my first and second year of college,
Okay.
way back. We don't need to go to the exact year, but sometime in the early 2000s. And I just really fell in love with this part of the world. It felt like home. It felt so peaceful. And I'm not sure why. I just felt so attracted and drawn to it. So ever since then, I lived for about 5 years in Egypt when I was undergraduate and graduate student. And I would come here a few times. I came here a few times and I keep on coming back. I keep on being pulled back to Turkey for some odd reason. And then 2016 and 17, I came here, one, to learn some art. And then I had a research project. So I figured out a grant and I got a grant to come here and do some amazing research with artists here. And I fell more deeply in love with living in Istanbul. And then I came here for my sabbatical, 2021, the height of COVID, and there's lockdowns, but I still came because I was like, I am going to take my sabbatical out of the country. I'm not going to stay in
Mm.
Los Angeles. And my sabbatical was supposed to be for 1 year, but here I am past the 3 year mark and I'm still here. And I quit my job and I'm not going back to Los Angeles. So,
There is so much courage woven in the whole story because not only is it the courage to move, the courage to quit a job where you're right, a tenured professor role, people just don't walk away from that,
mhm,
right?
yeah.
And the courage, even you're saying back, even in your early years in college, actually leaving the country to go study elsewhere.
Mhm.
I mean, that takes courage.
Yeah, I've always kind of wanted to live abroad. So even though I grew up in California, I went to Canada for my undergraduate because it was a different country. But I
Mhm.
went to British Columbia, so it was still on the West Coast. It was so culturally similar and close, but it was still a different country. So even from the age of 17, I left the country. I was right next door, but I've had a desire to live outside the US. And now I'm realizing that dream and that I don't plan on returning to the US.
How do your parents feel about that? Because I know my mum's not too
Yeah.
keen that I've come to the States, and she's like, "Do you think you'll ever come home?" I'm curious. What does your family
Yeah, well,
think?
my dad is from the UK and he moved to California in late 70s. So
Mhm.
I think it's only right that his daughter ended up moving across the world as
Yeah,
well.
it's in
He
the
couldn't
blood.
have expected anything different. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. There's a sense of understanding from his point of view. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get stuck into the episode.
Mhm.
So, every guest completes a questionnaire from a long list of identities. You picked four. What were they for you?
Yeah, so there's many different ones, but the four ones I'd like to focus on today are being a woman, being a working parent, primary caregiver, solo parent, being a religious minority, well, at least a religious minority where I'm from in the US, not where I live now, and then being a foreigner
Mhm.
where I live here in Turkey.
Yeah. Now, this is why I was super excited about today's episode, is because identity isn't fixed.
Mhm.
Labels aren't fixed. Our experience as being diverse or underrepresented is contextual. And
Mhm.
that's why I'm so excited to talk to you today to talk about your lived experience in the US as a cultural as a religious minority, and then flipping it back to now being in somewhere where you are a religious, like,
All
I don't
kinds of minorities.
majority, yeah, but then
Yeah.
you're a cultural minority because 'cause you're coming from the US, and so,
Mhm.
oh, I'm just so excited. Okay,
Yeah.
so where do we start? All right. So tell us about your religion and your experience as being a religious minority in the US first. I think that's where we can start.
Yeah, sure. So identify as Muslim, although my approach to Islam is a little bit more eclectic than most, and that, I also bring in other practices. I taught at a Christian university in the United States, and I would attend the chapel, not to pray as a Christian, but to join in the worship, praying in my way.
Mhm,
So I'm a multi-religious kind of person in that way, but I'm definitely Muslim in terms of practice and belief primarily.
mhm,
And that's really important for me because I was also a professor of religious studies and a professor of Islam specifically. So I wasn't just a Muslim in the United States. I was a professional Muslim in the United States.
mhm,
And in post 9/11 United States, that means something big. Being a professional Muslim means essentially your job is to condemn every terrorist act that happens around the world because of course all Muslims are responsible for the act of one crazy person in the other
mhm,
opposite end of the world,
mhm,
and then it also means being an apologist for all 1.8 billion Muslims. It means trying to humanize Muslims for people who tend to think that Muslims are possible terrorists.
mhm,
So that's what it means to be a professional Muslim is that I was always going to give talks, engaging in interfaith, and I love doing interfaith, but it can get a lot sometimes in that I'll give a talk about a very sophisticated topic, and at the end, people will say, they'll talk about CARE. CARE is the Council for American Islamic Relations. It's a really great organization that fights for Muslim American civil rights. But often someone will come up and say, "Isn't CARE funded by Hamas? Isn't it a terrorist organization?" I'm just like, I just spoke about women and gender and Sufism in medieval period, and you're asking me about CARE being a terrorist organization. Like, I don't even know what to tell you.
mhm,
But these kind of questions are so common. The idea that I'll just be walking around doing whatever I'm doing in a grocery store, like, doing going about my daily life, and someone will come up to me and ask me. And I used to wear more a full headscarf. Nowadays, you see, wear more of like a turban kind of style, but I used to wear the full scarf, which I would buy from like normal stores like Target or
mhm,
TJ Maxx. But people come up to me and say, "Why do you wear those clothes? It was those exotic clothes, and why do they hate us?" And I'm like, I'm here to just like. I'm just a normal person. Do you really go up to random other people and ask these kind of questions? Like, why me?
mhm,
But for some reason, especially when you're a Muslim woman and you visibly
mhm,
represent Islam, you're burdened with the fact that you have to represent 1.8 billion people just because of how you dress in the
mhm,
United States. It's
mhm.
still the case that a lot of Muslims are still suspect, still seen a disloyal to the United States, and most all Muslim Americans have a script because they all get asked these questions, and they all have a whole script ready to give people answers to what they always tend to ask.
Because I'm always trying to think of it from the point of view that the people that don't know but are curious to learn
Mhm.
for the right reasons. And I hope that those are the people that are listening to the podcast,
Yes, I
right?
hope so too.
I suppose I want to start with what's the impact on you? Like, I'm imagining, is there a specific call out that you remember of in a particular event, in a particular situation, someone said something and it really wasn't nice? Like, is there something that you can share with us so people can empathize and understand better on the impact of their words or their questions?
Hmm. It seems so far removed now, so I have to like
Right.
jog my memory a bit. It's when I read about Islamophobia still happening. I'm like, wow, that's still a thing. Haven't they gotten over it? Because I live in a place where it's so different now.
Well,
Um,
let's go down. Let's actually take, I mean, I think that's a perfect example or a segue to
yeah.
go, all right, here's the contrast.
What it feels like to be Muslim here versus there. I
Yeah,
can
let's
talk
do
about
that.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. Me and many other Muslim women from the West like to come here, even just for visits, because like I can breathe here.
Mm,
And I wear modest clothing, and people are like, she's just a woman. They don't see her in a specific way, especially because they're just foreigners, right? We're just foreigners here.
mm,
And people aren't going to ask stupid questions about Islam. Because even though there's a division among Turks between secular and more religious practicing Muslims and others who aren't very invested in Islam, everyone knows what Islam is, and
Mm,
everyone knows all Muslims are terrorists and basics that Americans are not yet aware of, right? Here, it's just not a thing. So a lot of Muslims like coming here for holiday, and quite a few have moved here from the West, actually, and other countries nearby in order to get a break from that burden of representation, the internal conflict that a lot of Muslims who are visible have to bear, like every action a Muslim in the United States take, if they're visible, is going to be watched very closely and they're going to represent Islam. So you have to be ultra polite, like let's say you like to speed or pass cars on the highway. You can't really because they're like, oh my God, look what Muslims do. Right. So the idea that you always have to be aware that you're being surveilled. Some Muslim communities are actually being surveilled by FBI and other organizations within the United States. I'm lucky in that have a lot of privilege, I think, that I haven't experienced as much direct Islamophobia as other friends and people I know.
mm,
And I was professor of religious studies, so that even though there was microaggressions, my experience was overall positive teaching in the department of religion, right? Where
mhm.
obviously people are not going to be directly anti-religion or Islamophobic in an apartment like that.
Okay,
So,
good
yeah.
question on that. So thinking about, you said you're in LA, right? So you're
Mhm,
in California. There is a
mhm,
certain culture in California, or I would say of inclusion, right? That they're more
mhm.
open to difference. Did you have students coming from other parts of the country to university or to college? I think you call it here. Um,
It was a university, yeah.
okay, it was a university. Coming from other parts of the country that perhaps hadn't had an inclusive experience in, and that sort of shared with you.
Yeah, great question. So, Southern California is a very diverse place. The university was quite diverse. It was interesting. I started working there in 2014 and it had a majority white student population. By the time I left in 2020 ish, 2022 is when I actually quit. Because of their Hispanic serving institution initiatives, they actually had a lot more minority students
Mm,
by the time I left. A lot more. It actually significantly changed the demographics of the classrooms. So that was an interesting process of seeing how different the student body became over those 6.5 years I was teaching on campus. And I would say there's such a big mixture. There's some students who have grown up in really diverse parts of California, for example. But LA and California has a lot of suburbs. And when you grow up in a specific kind of suburb, you're very sheltered from the rest
mm,
of society, really. And I feel like LA is all suburbs. Um, and if you grow up in one of them, they're not necessarily diverse. So unless you grew up in a very urban part of California, I was lucky enough to grow up in San Francisco, which is extremely, especially back then, diverse city. So I was
mhm.
exposed to that growing up. But a lot of these kids that I was working with were not exposed to much difference. So one of the biggest topics I would teach about that I really am invested in is this idea of pluralism and pluralism as a civic value as Americans. And I taught them pluralism, like why we need to value people for their differences and be curious about them because of their differences. Just like you also involved in Diane Eck. Diane Eck is a professor at Harvard who runs a pluralism project, and she was one of the key scholars we would use to talk about pluralism and why it's so important and why it's embedded within American values,
Yeah.
really. And so many students would be like, wow, I've never met anyone who's different from me. So many. And I would take them to a mosque, synagogue, and a church. We would mainly limit to the three religions because we didn't have time for all of them.
Yeah.
Sometimes in other classes, I would send them off on their own to Buddhist temple, Hindu temples, Sikh gurdwaras, for example. And it was mind blowing for them, really.
I'm curious, culturally, um, is divorce, single parenting, is that
Yeah.
something that's okay within the culture and the dominant religion?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, there's a couple layers to that question to answer because Turkey is a secular republic.
Okay.
It's been secular since 1923, which means the law is not according to Islamic law. Marriage and divorce are primarily secular, from what I know. I'm not an expert on Turkish law, but I know that a woman can initiate divorce and get it quite easily in this country. Whereas, for example, in Egypt or Saudi Arabia, they're implementing their interpretation of Islamic law, and it's much harder for women in those countries to get divorced. And for what I know, in the younger generations, 20s, 30s, 40s, it's getting much more common for divorce. I have a
Okay.
number of divorce friends. Almost always, like in elsewhere, the woman is initiating the divorce
Hmm.
due to abuse and other reasons. Just like in the U.S. and other countries, women are just saying no around the world to unhappy marriages, to abusive marriages, basically.
Go women,
Um,
just saying.
yeah, I don't have the stats for Turkey, but
Yeah.
definitely it's on the rise like everywhere else in the world. It's hard though. It's hard enough to be a single mom in the United States, but I think here is even harder because family values are so strong.
Mhm.
They have more support in that their mother might not be working, so they might have the support of their mother to help with the children, not
Mhm.
always, but they might have more of that than the United States. They might have aunts and other relatives who can help out, so they might have that support, but it's also a little bit taboo, to be divorced, you know?
Yeah.
So, whereas it's getting more common, it's still a little awkward.
Yeah.
I'm personally not embarrassed or ashamed by my status. I'm quite proud of it because it means I liberated myself from a very
Mhm.
difficult situation. But for a lot of women, it's difficult financially because in this country, primarily, women often stop working when they get married, and
Okay.
that means financially they're often dependent on the husbands, which, as we know, can be quite dangerous and risky.
Mhm.
And so that makes it harder for women to get divorced. So I know lots of instances here where women can't get divorced because of financial reasons, or if they do, it's a very big struggle.
Mm. Well, it makes me then question if it is more of a culture that relies on the family unit for support and raising children and things like that. Well, what's the support like in childcare availability for
Uh-huh.
someone like yourself? How does that is that
That's a
available?
great question. I'm currently looking for a babysitter because the last one got a little flaky,
Uh-huh.
unfortunately. And it's weird because I'll ask Turkish friends, I need help, I need a babysitter. So common in the US, everyone needs a babysitter. I don't need an everyday babysitter. I need an occasional one when I need a girls' night out. I need someone to come and hang out with my 10-year-old so I can just have some enjoyable time with only adults. And it's actually not easy to find a babysitter.
Okay.
Surprisingly common to have a nanny, like kind of more full time for a younger child.
Hmm.
I think at this age, they tend to rely on family or
Yeah.
they just don't have a life. A lot of mothers I know, parents I know, they really don't have much of a social life apart from family.
Mm.
Whereas I have a very active social life, which is a lot. Some more traditional Turkish women I meet, they're quite astonished by my like lifestyle, I guess you could say, because I'm always doing things and I'm active and it's quite unusual for some people. For other parts of Turkish society, it's quite normal.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I'm currently looking for one. It's not actually easy to find one because an occasional babysitter is a really kind of a weird concept here.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah, either you have family members or friends or neighbors who can help. And obviously, in
Okay.
our situation, my son would need someone who speaks English, and so neighbors aren't an option where we live.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then that gets me thinking around your being able to establish friendships and relationships with
Yeah,
other women. If How has that gone for you? Because if they're not
yeah,
working, it's all I don't know. I'm curious. Was
yeah.
it easy,
Well,
hard?
Well, I have a combination of Turkish and foreign women friends, and we all speak English, because when I came here and I quit my job, I built a business from scratch, which means so much of my energy and time has gone into learning the skills I need to become a life coach, a breathwork teacher, to run a business. That's a lot of back end skills I've had to build, which means I haven't had any time or energy to put into Turkish language building, unfortunately. As much as in the past, I've been learning languages, this time I have not yet done that as much as I'd like to. So that means that pretty much everyone in my life speaks English or some Arabic, which I'm fluent in Arabic, but primarily English. So I've been able to meet some amazing women, absolutely amazing, both Turkish and from different countries in the world. So I have quite an international group of friends who make up my community.
Mm. So,
And
oh, go
yeah,
on.
go ahead.
I was
Yeah.
going to say. So, what brought those people to Turkey? I'm just so
Yeah.
curious.
Yeah. So like among the Turkish friends, a lot of them have lived abroad for some time. Like one of them grew up partially in the UK, one of them went to university abroad. For example, women who wear headscarves were often had to leave the country to go to university because I don't remember what year it was, until maybe a few years ago, women were not allowed to enter the university in a headscarf in universities in Turkey because it's a secular nation that the government enforced anti-hijab laws in public environments until very recently. So I remember going to the university years ago and watching women take off their scarves as they went into university. So my friends who wear hijabs, most of them went abroad for university because they were not allowed to wear their headscarf freely in a Muslim majority country like Turkey because
And
it's secular.
that's why my jaw is almost on the floor.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, it's crazy. So they've had a lot of international experience because of that. And then among my international friends, some people have come here because their husbands have jobs and then they are stay-at-home moms and they come with a husband. But a lot of my friends, some of them are also single or married women who felt called to move here. It's odd. There's like this community of expats who feel at home here and feel drawn to be here. And none of us were like, we just like it here. We just feel so called. There's people like me who just really enjoy living here and rather live here than where they're from.
yeah,
Um, and then there's some who work, they're teachers or they work for organizations here.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm thinking back to the roll-on effect of government policy of
Hmm.
preventing an individual from getting an education because
Hmm.
of a piece of clothing they wear.
Yeah.
So I just want to be really clear to listeners. This is just about a piece of clothing you wear, and it is about blocking someone's access to education. So
Hmm.
where Rose was sharing the example that people went abroad, that requires a certain you have to be a certain level of privilege to be able to afford to
Hmm.
go and study overseas. So what about everybody else that just
Yeah.
is denied the education because of that?
Yeah, what's really interesting is I've met a number of women who weren't able to go to university because of this, and some of them went to like art schools or like kind of technical institutes or kind of were apprenticed. So either they got married, didn't get a college education, or they found creative ways of getting some sort of education, but not a university degree. So, or some of them, if they're privileged enough, could afford private university. These were public
Sure.
universities that are affordable and accessible.
Yeah.
Some private universities allowed headscarves at that time. Now anyone can wear whatever they want.
The ripple effect of denying, I mean, it's forcing someone to make a different career
Mhm.
choice. Just it's
Yeah,
forcing your hand. Wow. Okay.
yeah.
That's huge. And I hope
And
everybody can just if you translate like that into your normal life, right? We
mm,
might not be government decision makers. We
mhm,
might be setting a policy in our own organization that, okay, you have to wear, or even flight attendants having to wear a skirt with pantyhose and high
mhm.
heels. Occupational health and safety, please, bad backs. I'm just, you've got to think about what's the roll on effect of policies that you're putting in place. And
Yeah,
really, are they necessary?
yeah,
Like, seriously, because of something that you wear.
yeah. And people
Okay.
wouldn't expect this in a Muslim majority country like
No.
Turkey. They think it's an oppressive Muslim country, whereas it's actually the somewhat the opposite in some
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah. Okay.
Um,
Rose, this is awesome. I mean, not awesome. Not awesome that it happened. Awesome what I'm
yeah,
learning and we're sharing with
yeah.
people. Okay. So you're saying that you don't yet speak Turkish fluently. Did that pose barriers for you aside from making friends outside of English
Mhm.
speaking friends? What about with your business? I mean, even just going to the grocery store?
For my business, it's fine because I work internationally online and I
Okay.
work with English speakers, and there's more English speakers than than Turkish speakers, for example. And it is really hard not to speak fluent Turkish. Yesterday, I made quite a big purchase, and I had a Turkish friend to help me through the process. Without a friend, I couldn't have done it. Some small things are really hard. For example, going to the hospital for like if my son's sick. There's very little English spoken at all, but the most elite hospitals, which I cannot afford. So I go to the regular hospital.
Mm,
It is hard. Like, in the US, I would just easily make an appointment and go. I could just do it on my phone on the app. Here, it's not so easy. And I must say, I don't always go as often as I want to because of that barrier,
yeah, wow.
So I can get by in the grocery store and the restaurant, like enough. If they say a long sentence, I'm like, I don't know what you're saying. Thank,
Yeah.
thank God for Google Translate. I love that app.
Yes.
It has a conversation thing where you can make it in both languages, two ways. It's amazing, and that the Google Translate camera, so I can just stick it, um, point it towards whatever I need translated. I feel somewhat guilty that, I haven't because when I lived in Egypt for 5 years, I became incredibly fluent in Arabic. I still can speak it fluently and I really integrated well, but I was also young, childless. I had this fellowship and my job was to study Arabic, literally. My
Mm.
job is not to say Turkish, my job is to currently support my family in
Yeah.
English.
You give us a good story for us to then translate and replicate on the flip side back
Mhm.
to if we're in a dominant English speaking
Yeah.
country and we're listening to this podcast because it's in English.
Yeah.
Um, and that these are the sorts of barriers that people that come into other English speaking countries that don't speak
Yeah.
English to start with.
Exactly.
Um, if we talk about asylum seekers, for
Mhm.
instance, and even just to set up a phone with a phone carrier,
Yeah.
how difficult that is. And even when you're saying, Rose, you perhaps may not
Mhm.
even seek medical care
Yeah.
as often as you need it. I mean, here we're actually impacting
Mhm.
outcomes of
Yeah.
people because of those barriers.
I have
Um,
so much more respect for immigrants now, like I have, but like just to move to another country and yeah, to do what they do is amazing.
mm,
America has more accommodations than they have in Turkey because America is a land of immigrants here. They have almost no accommodations for
mhm,
foreigners and they don't actually like foreigners. There's definitely an underlying level of xenophobia in this country, unfortunately.
okay.
I guess US has it as well, but it's also a land made for immigrants. This country is a land made for Turks. It's
Yeah.
called Turkey, the land of Turks. Ataturk is the father of Turks. So it's different than the United States. Yeah.
Which brings something to mind. You're saying that you felt like you could breathe, that people just
Mhm.
see you as a woman and not the other layers that they're
Yeah.
seeing, and holding you to account for something.
Mhm.
I'm curious then, does that mean you pass? I talk to people that are trans and they
Yes.
talk about they pass well. They don't like the word, but
Yeah.
there is a passing. I'm
Probably one of the
curious.
reasons why it's a good place to live is that until I speak, I can pass.
Yeah.
I can pass, yes. Like, someone who really can who's, like, really good, they know, but most people think I'm Turkish, actually,
Mm,
yes. And I must say, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, it's just an automatic reflex I have is it feels safer to pass,
yeah,
to not stand out wherever I live.
yeah.
In the US, I guess, it was interesting because I couldn't like, I was American, but then the headscarf labeled me as foreign. And it
Mm,
was a very different concept, a different approach because people would approach me and say, "Oh, where are you from?" And they would expect me to say like Syria, Iran, and I would say, "Oh, I'm from San Francisco." And they're like, "Where are you really from?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm from San Francisco," like,
yeah.
and they really expected me to be foreign, and I couldn't pass even though that's where I'm from, and they wouldn't believe me.
So, okay, that perfectly highlights and reflects how sometimes diversity is not how we see ourselves. It's purely the labels others are assigning to us because of what they
Mhm.
see. So, there would be this sort of conflict in your mind. I don't imagine that you saw yourself in any other way than American,
Mhm.
but
Yeah, I
someone
grew up
else
there.
project. Yeah.
Yeah, it's my culture. I mean, I feel comfortable outside the United States, to be honest. I feel like a global citizen, truly,
Mhm.
because I feel comfortable here. I understand the culture quite well, despite the language barrier. Sometimes America feels more alien and foreign to me, maybe
Mhm.
because of the way it's treated, not because of anything else.
Yeah.
But it's also a place I know very well. I know how to deal with, I know how to live there.
Yeah. Such wonderful learnings today, actually. Thank you for
Mhm.
sharing. So when we were talking about, and I don't know whether we're doing it on air or off air, but we were talking about my academic research, and you said that you yourself have a book. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I started the book process in 2018, and the book is finally coming out in a couple months, maybe a month or two, with Oxford University Press. It's called Muslim Prayer in American Public Life. And it basically came out of a book chapter I wrote before that about prayer practices among American Muslims because my training is partially ethnographic in nature. So I was just studying and talking to Muslims about how do they pray? Where do they pray? Which kind of is a strange question because when you read any textbook on Islam and prayer, Muslims pray 5 times a day. This is how they do it. So why should I ask them about how they pray? Like, but when you pray outside a Muslim majority country where there's mosque everywhere, where you can pray anywhere and people like, yeah, they're just praying. When you pray in a Western country, it's a completely different ballgame. And
Mm,
so that's why I started this project, and this chapter became more than a chapter. It ended up getting published in a book. I was like, this is so interesting because I was realizing that I had ways of praying when I was outside. And then I started asking other people, oh, you too? Like, when you're at Target, for example, everyone knows, all Muslims know, if you just take a garment to try on, you can also pray in the dressing room, for example. It's a great place to
Right.
pray, for example. Or, like as a student, what you do is you go to like the top floor to like the stacks that no one ever goes to, and that's where you pray, for example. So you like have these hacks on where to find really quiet, hidden places to pray. Why
That
do you
sounds like an app. You need to do an app that people can.
exactly, exactly. Well,
Yeah,
there is an app to find like mosque and prayer
of
rooms, but
course.
not to find weird locations
Yeah,
like that. That would be
you need
funny.
one for the weird locations.
But
So,
that's actually dangerous because if the wrong person
oh,
finds it, can you imagine what that would mean?
there's my privilege
So
showing,
this is actually
Rose.
what the book is about why do Muslims find hidden away quiet places is because of Islamophobia. So that's why it's different to be Muslim in the West. And if you're a practicing Muslim who prays 5 times a day, that means that at least three of your prayers happen during like the regular, they happen noontime, mid-afternoon, sunset. You're often going to be outside the home or far away from a mosque, which means how do you pray? Where do you pray? If you're a student in a big lecture hall during prayers and you want to pray, like where are you going to do it?
Yeah.
And why do you want to do it hidden? Because the assumption, I have a whole chapter about how the media portrays and connects prayer to terrorism.
Mm,
I did an analysis of Hollywood films and TV shows that every time Muslims, terrorists, pray, they then usually do something violent, like do
yeah,
suicide bombing, and they have that insidious music, like do do do, like they're gonna
yeah, yeah,
when they pray. And so prayer is associated by a lot of Americans as being something connected to terrorism.
mm,
So that there's quite a few Americans, if they hear the term Allahu Akbar, people
yeah,
think it means I'm going to blow myself up. Whereas really, it's a phrase that is incredibly beautiful. That means God is most great. Nothing is greater than God.
mhm,
Muslims say this frequently throughout the day in their prayers and other times to say, wow, this is amazing. Like, oh my God.
yeah,
Muslims say Allahu Akbar. It's literally the same
yeah,
thing as
right.
oh my God.
Yeah.
Um, but a lot of Americans associate that with terrorism.
Wow.
So that means that Muslim Americans, actually, there's a lot of studies about the mental health of Muslim Americans. They have heightened increase of anxiety and stress, paranoia, because partially because of being their Muslimness. So Muslims who appear visibly Muslim and then who have to carry out activities that are Muslim in
Mm,
public is very stressful and anxiety provoking because imagine you're at a workplace, you don't want your colleagues to know you're practicing Muslim because then they're going to think you're possibly up to something,
yeah,
um, you know, uh, against the American people. So you're going to hide your prayers. Or maybe there are no accommodations. So my book was about
yeah,
accommodations, the
yeah,
how they're given or how they're not given, legal cases, ramifications. How do Muslims navigate the weird places they pray?
yeah,
How Muslims use prayer as protest, sometimes and protest as prayer. Yeah, it's basically covered like how is prayer different and how does it manifest itself
yeah.
among Muslims in the United States in ways that most people would not ever guess?
Okay, so I want to call myself out for my privilege on this. So the fact that I made a silly assumption that you would feel safe to pray, that I would think an app. I just did not think of the cause and effect of making people know where others may be praying and be vulnerable at a certain point in time. So thank you for bringing that to my attention. Firstly,
It's an
I
unfortunate
also,
thing. Yeah.
yeah, I just want to call to attention as well the importance of representation in non-stereotypical ways. You
Mhm.
know, whether you work in film and television or marketing and advertising and branding, really be conscious to use different identities in
Mhm.
non-stereotypical empowered
Yes.
ways. You know, that is how we start to reflect people in their truth
Mhm.
versus in their stereotype. Rose, I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours underwater, I think. um, I don't drink coffee, but I feel like we could have a Turkish coffee together.
Yes.
I'll have a tea. Um, Turkish delight, though. That is one delicacy I can't do without. Look, I want to ask as well. You mentioned before around when you've transitioned away from academia and you're working in lifting others up to be unstuck in their lives. So tell us more about that magic you're bringing to the world now.
Yeah, thanks for asking. So, I was a professor of Islamic and religious studies, and I was teaching pluralism and all these topics. And I was like, it's very theoretical. I was teaching about religion, spirituality, but mainly talking about it, right? And it was a good format for me, a good venue, but I realized that I wanted to do more. I'm an action-oriented kind of person, and I realized the Ivory Tower wasn't necessarily the place where I'm going to carry out my vision, really.
Mhm.
Because on the side, I was, volunteering at my local mosque. I was speaking at churches and synagogues and doing all these things. And that actually was like my passion. I loved doing that, but I wasn't actually getting paid for it. It was
Yeah.
just a passion project. And I was like, I want things to change. I want like people to have better lives because I was, they met me or something. So when I was trying to figure out, like, I was on sabbatical, how can I sustain myself? If I stay here, I need a way to make money and I need to pivot careers. What am I going to do? I looked into some regular careers that I could do remotely. None of them really interested me. I was like, okay, I've gotten a lot of support from coaches. I have one mentor who really edged me on in that direction. She was like, "This really might work for you," because I dreamed of leading retreats and supporting women, and I had done this in a smaller scale. So I took the leap after meeting with a number of people who really encouraged me and telling me more about what it was like. And it feels like now what I'm doing is really applied religious and spiritual studies, essentially.
Mhm.
So I'm doing the
Okay.
same thing as I was in academia, but now it's applied.
Yeah.
It's practical theology almost. In that I work with anyone from who's spiritually oriented, but I work a lot with Muslim women primarily, and that was my passion before, and now I just get to do it, and I support them in all kinds of ways. And it really feels right for me,
Mm.
and because of my religious studies background, I'm able to support people through some of their religious and spiritual struggles, inner
Mhm.
conflicts, existential issues, through overcoming religious and spiritual trauma and abuse, for example. I've tried to look for ways to leverage my background into a way that makes sense and
Mm.
feels complete for me.
Well, I'm going to make sure all your contact details are in the podcast description. So if someone would like to, they can get in contact with you.
Thank you.
Um, Brilliant episode today. Thank you so much for your time.